Chapter 8. To his surprise, Valens was curious. He'd expected to feel scared, horrified, or revolted, as though he was getting ready to meet an embassy of goblins. Maybe I don't scare so easily these days, he thought, but he knew he was missing the point. Well, he said, we'd better not keep them waiting. He nudged his horse forward. It started to move, its head still down, its mouth full of fat, green spring grass. It was a singularly graceless, slovenly animal, but it had a wonderful turn of speed. I've never met one before. What are they like? Young Gabius on his left, trying to look calm. Valens noticed that he was wearing a heavy wool cloak over his armor, and the sleeves of double-weight gambeson poked out from under the steel vambraces on his forearms. Curious, since Gabius had always insisted he despised the heat, then Valens realized he dressed up extra warm to make sure he wouldn't shiver. I don't know, Valens replied. It's hard to say, really. I guess the key word is different. Different, Gabius replied. Different in what way? In pretty much every way, I suppose, Valens replied. They don't look anything like us. Their clothes are nothing like ours. Their horses, either bloody great things you'd happily plow with or little thin ponies. Like everything, you'd expect one thing, you get another. The difficulty is there's so many of them. Different tribes and sects and splinter groups and all. You can't generalize till you know exactly what lot you're dealing with. I see, Gabius said nervously. So you can't really know what to expect when they come at you. Valens grinned. Trouble, he said. That's a constant. It's the details that vary. According to the Herald, Skedanlothi and his raiding party were waiting for them on the edge of the wood, where the river vanished into the trees. Valens knew very little about the enemy leader, little more than what he'd learned from a couple of stragglers his scouts had brought in the day before. According to them, Skedanlothi was the second or third son of the High King's elder brother. He'd brought a raiding party into Vidani territory in order to get plunder. He wanted to marry, apparently, and his half of the takings was to be the dowry. The men with him, presumably, had similar motives. If they were offered enough money, they'd probably go away without the need for bloodshed. Beats me, Gabius went on, how they got here at all. I thought it was impossible to get across the desert, no water. Valens nodded. That's the story, he said. Unfortunately for us, most of the Curie Hardy believe it, with good reason, because raiding parties go out every few years and none of them ever come back. They assume, naturally enough, that the raiders die in the desert. He yawned. It was a habit of his when he was nervous. But there is a way. Some cloud of a trader found it a few years ago. Being a trader, of course, she didn't tell anybody, apart from the people in her company. Then one of their caravans got itself intercepted by one of the Curie Hardy sects. Wonderful, Gabius said. Actually, not as bad as all that. Valens yawned again. It was a mannerism he made no effort to rid himself of, since it made him look fearless. The Curie Hardy are worse than the traders for keeping secrets from each other. I think it was the Lauzida who first got hold of it. They'd rather be buried alive in anthills than share a good thing with the Auziel or the Flosklaya. Even within a particular sect, they don't talk to each other. Something like a safe way to get across the desert is an opportunity for one faction to get rich and powerful at the expense of the others. Sooner or later, of course, the High King or one of his loathsome relations will get hold of it, and then we'll be in real trouble. Meanwhile, we have to deal with minor infestations like this one. It's never much fun, but it could be worse. Sort of like the difference between a wasp's nest in the roof and a plague of locusts. Gabius had gone quiet. Valens made an effort not to smile. A first encounter with the Curie Hardy was rather like your first time after a boar on foot in the woods. Most people survived it, but some didn't. Valens had done it before 6 or 7 times, so he wasn't too disconcerted when the escort turned up. How they did it, he had no idea. They seemed to materialize out of thin air. One moment the Vidani had been alone on the flat moor, the next they were surrounded by armored horsemen. Valens made no effort to stifle a third yawn. He knew from experience that it impressed the Curie Hardy too. Not Lauzida, he decided. Maybe that was a good thing, maybe not. The Lauzida, who wore long coats of hardened leather scale and conical helmets with nasals and aventails, were clever, imaginative fighters. Tremendous speed and flexibility based on innate horsemanship and constant practice. This lot, on the other hand, wore coats of plates over fine mail, and their rounded helmets had cheek pieces and articulated neck guards. At a guess that made them partets or aram chantat, he knew nothing about either set, beyond the basics of fashions and armor, and he didn't want to think about how the secret of the safe passage had penetrated right down to the far south. At least they'd be the one or the other rather than both. The Partets and the Aram Chantat hated each other even more than the Auziel, the Clairvots, the Rosenhallet, or the Flosklaya. On balance, he decided, He'd rather they were the Partets. They were, of course, the Aram-Chantat. Their demands were simple: 400,000 gold thalers, or 2 million in silver, and 500 horses, at least half of them brood mares. Delivery. Their interpreter spoke tolerably clear Mezentine, with a firm grasp of the specialist vocabulary of the extortion business, within 3 days, during which time the raiding party would be left to forage at will. Once payment had been made, they undertook to leave Vidani territory within a week, causing no further damage, provided that they were kept supplied with food, wine, and fodder for the horses. Nobody said anything about what would happen if their demands weren't met. No need to go into all that. Valens replied that he'd think it over, and to send his answer before daybreak. The horseman watched him go, then vanished. "So," Gabius asked, after they'd ridden halfway back to the camp, "what are you going to do?" "I'm not sure yet," Valens answered. Back at his camp, he sent for the people he wanted to see, and put guards on the tent door so he wouldn't be disturbed. Just after midnight, most of the staff officers left. 2 riders were sent back on the road to Civitas Vidanis. Their departure wasn't lost on the Aram-Chantat scouts, who reported back to their leaders. Around 3 in the morning, they saw a great number of watchfires being lit on the far side of the camp, where the horse pens were, and sent word back to Sked and Lothi to prepare for a sneak attack at first light. The messengers never got there. They were intercepted by the Vidani light cavalry, dismounted and covering the left flank, and efficiently disposed of. An hour later, the scouts sent another message to say that the heavy cavalry had mounted up and ridden due west, which they took to mean a wide encircling movement. Valens let them through. They reached Sked and Lothi an hour and a half before dawn. He drew up his forces in dead ground below his camp, facing west, to surprise the heavy cavalry when they arrived. They never did, of course. What the scouts had seen was the horses being led away by their grooms. The heavy cavalry, also dismounted, came up the east side of the camp, and launched a sudden noisy attack that took the Aram-Chantat reserves completely by surprise. Someone had the presence of mind to send riders to the main army on the west side, who came scrambling back just in time to be taken in flank and rear by the light cavalry and the infantry. It was still a tricky business. The Curie Hardy were on horseback. Valens' men were on foot. It was still too dark for accurate shooting, and the coats of plates and mail took some piercing. Valens told his archers to aim for the horses rather than the men, and set up his infantry to engage Sked Lothi's personal guard. If the Curie Hardy had been huntsmen, they'd have understood what Valens was up to. Let the dogs face the boar while the hunters come in at it from the side. Valens led the infantry himself, because they were going to have to face the boar's tusks. As always on these occasions, as soon as he'd given word to move up, he found he was almost paralyzed with fear. His stomach muscles twisted like ropes, and he wet himself. But it was his job to stay 3 paces ahead of the line. If you don't keep your place, nobody knows where you are, and you're liable to come to harm. At the same time as he was forcing his legs to move, he was struggling to hold the full picture in his mind. Movements of men and horses, timings, closures, and avoidances. 40 yards across open ground in the pale thick light, and then someone stood out in front of him, a man who wanted to kill him. He let go of the grand design, and concentrated on the job at hand. Fighting 600 enemies in 4 dimensions over 35 acres is one thing. Fighting one man within arm's length is something else entirely. Someone had told him once, the first thing to do is always look at the other man's face, see who you're up against. Once you've done that, keep your eyes glued to his hands. Whether it was good advice or not, Valens wasn't sure, but he followed it anyway because it was the only method that he knew. On this occasion, the other man was big and broad, but the look on his face and the puckering of his eyes told Valens that he'd been asleep and wasn't quite awake yet. He had a spear in his right hand and a round shield on his left arm. He was maybe inclined to hide behind the shield, conceding distance and therefore time. It was therefore essential that the other man should attack first. This, however, he was annoyingly reluctant to do, and a whole second passed while the 2 of them stood and looked at each other. That wasn't right, so Valens took a half step forward just inside the other man's reach. He recognized the mistake, but he wasn't watching where Valens put his feet. He lunged, spear and shield thrust forward together, in a semi-ferocious hedging of bets. Valens stepped forward into the right with his back foot, a fencing move he'd learned from the tiresome instructor when he was a boy, grabbed the back rim of the shield with his left hand, and twisted as hard as he could from the waist. His enemy was a stronger man, but he hadn't been expecting anything like that. He stumbled forward, and Valens stabbed him in the hollow just below the ear, where the ear flap of his helmet left a half-finger width of gap. The whole performance took less time than sneezing, and not much more effort. The dead man's forward momentum pulled him obligingly off Valens' sword, so that a half-turn brought him neatly back on guard. This would have been a good place to finish a well-planned, controlled encounter, practically textbook. Instead, he found himself facing two men with spears at precisely the moment when someone else, way off to his right, shot him in the shoulder with an arrow. It skidded off, needless to say, without piercing the steel of the pauldron, but he wasn't expecting the impact, about the same as being kicked by a bullock, and it made him drop his sword. His first thought was to get his feet out of the way of the falling sharp thing. He skipped, found he was off balance from the impact of the arrow, and staggered like a drunk. One of the two Curie Hardy stabbed him in the pit of the stomach with his spear. Again, the armor held good, but he lost his footing altogether and fell backward, landing badly. All the breath jarred out of his lungs, like air from a bellows, and he saw his enemy take a step forward. He could visualize the next stage, the foot planted on his chest and the spear point driven down through the eye slot of his helmet, but instead the other man stepped forward and went away. Some time later, thinking it through for the 100-and-something time, he realized that his opponent had assumed the spear thrust had killed him. He lay still and quiet, while men, enemies, and friends walked and ran around and over him. Someone trod on his elbow, someone else stepped on his cheek, but his helmet took the weight. He knew he was too terrified to move. He had seen animals behave in exactly the same way. A hare surrounded by 4 hounds, crouching absolutely still, a partridge with a broken wing, dropped by the hawk after an awkward swoop, lying in the snow with its eye 2 perfect concentric circles. Someone had told him once that predatory animals can only see movement. If the quarry stays still, they lose sight of it. He hoped it was true, because he had no other option. Sometime later, a hand reached down and pulled him up. His legs weren't working and he slumped, but someone caught him and asked if he was all right. The voice was Vidani, not the intonation of someone addressing his duke. He muttered, "Thanks, I'm fine," and whoever it was let him go and went away. He shook his head like a wet dog and looked up. Directly in front of him, the sun was rising. In front of it, he could see a smaller, thinner fire rising from a Curie Hardy tent. There were many men in front of him, only a few behind, and most of the bodies on the ground, still or moving slightly, were Curie Hardy. Valens wasn't a man who jumped to conclusions, but the first indications were hopeful. Probably they'd won. In which case, he scrabbled in his memory for the shape of the battle. In that case, the dismounted cavalry should by now have stove in the enemy flank, allowing his infantry to roll them up onto their camp, where the heavy cavalry should have been waiting to take them in rear. That would be satisfactory on the higher level. More immediately relevant, the enemy's survivors and stragglers would tend to be squeezed out at either end, and once they were clear of the slaughter, they'd turn east, which was the direction he was facing. He turned round, but he couldn't see anybody coming toward him. They were all right, then. Someone, a Vidani infantryman in a hurry, shouted at him, but he didn't catch what the man had said. Immediate dangers, mostly from the Curie Hardy knocked down or wounded if he got in their way. His people would, of course, notice sooner or later that he wasn't where he was supposed to be. Battles had been lost at the last moment because a general had been killed or was believed to be dead. Warily, and worried about the pain and weakness in his ankle, he turned it over when he fell. He started to run after the main body of his men. He was about 5 yards, then slowed to an energetic hobble. It was just as well that someone recognized him. There was shouting, men turning round and running toward him, like the surge of well-wishers who greet an athlete as he crosses the finishing line, as though he'd done something wonderful just by still being alive. "What happened to you?" someone roared in his ear, as overprotective hands grabbed and mauled him. "Are you all right? We thought—" "I'm not. What's happening?" "Like a bloody charm. Rolled them up like a carpet." Suddenly Valens found that he no longer cared terribly much. "That's good," he said. "What's the full picture? I've been out of it." Someone made a proper report. Someone else kept interrupting with conflicting but mostly trivial information. Valens tried to summon the clear diagram back in his mind, but it was crumpled and torn. He couldn't put it all together. For some reason, that ruined any feeling of accomplishment he might have. Not like a hunt, where you have the tangible proof of success, dead meat stretched out on the grass. There are plenty of dead bodies, but in war, they aren't the point. Success is vaguer, more metaphysical. Perhaps for the first time, Valens admitted to himself that he found the whole business revolting, even a relatively clean victory as this appeared to be. His mind slipped on the idea, because war was his trade as the Duke of the Vidani, but he felt a phrase coalesce in his mind. Given the choice between killing animals and killing people, I'd rather kill animals. The fighting was still going on, bits and pieces, scraps of unfinished business, but that could all be left to sergeants and captains. He allowed information to slide off him like water off feathers. Then someone said, "And we got the chief. Let's get in, what's it?" Valens looked up. He was being escorted back to the camp by 6 men whose names he ought to know but couldn't remember offhand. "Fine," he said. "He's back at the camp." It took a moment for Valens to realize that they meant the man was still alive. Now that was interesting. "Good," he said. "I'll see him in an hour. Find an interpreter." "He speaks Mezentine," someone says. "Quite well, actually." Catching them alive, that was an interesting idea. Worth the effort because you could talk to them and learn from them. He remembered the conversations he had the previous day, riding to the parlay. "Find that young clown Gabius and fetch him along," he said. "He was dead keen to meet a real Curie Hardy." Nobody said anything for long enough to make words unnecessary. Pity. The boy was a second cousin, and he remembered him from years back. From before it happened. From before father died and everything changed. Why is it, Valens wondered, that I tend to think of that time as real life and everything that's happened since I become Duke, as some sort of dream or pretense? He made a resolution to have Skedon Lothy's throat cut after he'd finished chatting with him. Barbaric and unfair, but so was his second cousin getting killed in a stupid little show like this. Once they brought him to his tent, they left him alone for a while. He had to shout at them a bit, but they got the message. Slowly, taking his time over each buckle and tightly knotted point, he took off his armor. It was a ritual. He had no idea what it meant or why he found it useful. As usual, it had taken a degree of abuse. The middle lame on the pauldron that had turned the arrow was bent, so that the unit no longer flexed smoothly. If he tried to strike a blow, it would probably have jammed up. The armor would fix it, of course, and he'd have a word or two to say about the fit. There was a small dent in the placket of the breastplate where the man had struck him with the spear. A couple of rivets had torn through on the left cuisse. It pleased him to be able to shed his bruised steel skin like a snake, and have his smooth, soft, unmarked skin underneath. The simple act of taking off 40 pounds of steel is as refreshing as a good night's sleep, inevitably makes you feel livelier. Each limb weighs less, takes less effort to move. It's like being in water or suddenly being much younger, fitter, and stronger. Each shedding of the skin marks a stage in growth, even if it's only death avoided one more time. Each time I get away with it, he thought, I really ought to come out of it a deeper, wiser, better person. Shame about that. A page came in, properly diffident, and left behind a plate of bread and cheese and a big jug of water. He'd forgotten the cup, but Valens grinned and drank from the jug, putting the spout in his mouth and swallowing. He ate the cheese and most of the bread, instinctively moving his hand to sweep the leftovers onto the floor for the dogs, but there weren't any, not here, and put the plate down on the bed. His ankle was throbbing, but he knew it was just a minor wrench, something that would sort itself out in a day or so. His shoulder and arm would be painful tomorrow, but they hadn't stiffened up yet. He got to his feet and went to find the prisoner. They had him in a small tent in the middle of the camp. He was sitting on a big log, which Valens thought was odd until he saw the chain, a steel collar around the poor bastard's neck and the end of the chain attached to the log by a big staple. Someone brought him one of those folding chairs. He gauged the length of the chain and added to it the fullest extent of the prisoner's reach, put the chair down, and sat on it. 2 guards stood behind him. "Hello," he said. "I'm Valens." Skedon Lothy looked at him. "My people tell me," Valens went on, "that I won the battle, and that your lot have been wiped out to the last man." He paused. The other man was looking at him as though he was the ugliest thing in the world. "I don't suppose that's strictly true. There'll be 1 or 2 stragglers who have slipped outside the net, but they won't get far, I don't suppose. If it'd help, we've counted." He took out a slip of paper he'd been given. "Let's see, 523 dead, 72 captured. If you're fond of round numbers, I make that 5 unaccounted for. If you like, you could tell me how many you started the day with, and then I'd know for sure." Skedon Lothy didn't like, apparently. Valens hadn't expected him to. "We rounded up a few of your scouts the other day," he went on, "and they said you came out here to steal enough to get married on, is that right?" No reply. So he leaned back a little on his chair and gave one of the guards some instructions. The guards moved forward. Skedon Lothy jumped up, but the guard knelt smoothly down, grabbed a handful of the chain, and yanked hard. Skedon Lothy went down on his face, and the guard pressed his boot on his neck. "Keep going till he says something," Valens called out. "He's no bloody use if he just sits there staring." It was quite some time before Skedon Lothy screamed. Valens had the guard apply a few extra pounds of pressure just to convince him that he couldn't stand pain. Then he asked the guard to help him back onto his log and repeated the question. "Yes," Skedon Lothy said. He was rubbing his neck, not surprisingly. "It's the custom of our people." "To win honor and respect, I suppose," Valens said. "Yes." "Presumably," Valens went on, "most of the time you raid each other, the Aram Chantat against the Partets, the Doce Votes against the Rosenhalet, and so forth." This time Skedonlathi nodded. That's interesting, Valens said. To most of us, you're all just Kiri-Hardy. We don't think of you as a lot of little tribes beating each other up. To us, you're hundreds of thousands of savages penned in by a desert. He paused. Why do you fight each other like that? Skedonlathi frowned, as though the question didn't make sense. They are our enemies, he said. Why? It took Skedonlathi a moment to answer. They always have been. We fight over grazing, water, cattle, everything. Valens raised his eyebrows. Why? He said. By all accounts, it's a huge country south of the desert. Can't you just move out of each other's way or something? Skedonlathi shook his head. Most of the land is bad, he said. The cattle graze a valley for 3 years and grass stops growing, so we have to move away till it comes right. Onto somebody else's land, Valens said. Land doesn't belong to anybody, Skedonlathi said. It's just there. We drive them off it, they have to go somewhere else. When it's all eaten up, we have to move again. Everybody moves. Valens thought about that for a moment. You all move around, like the chair dance. Skedonlathi scowled. Dance? We have this children's game, Valens explained. The dancers dance round in a ring, and in the middle there's a row of chairs, one for each dancer. When the music stops, everyone grabs a chair. Then one chair gets taken out and the dance starts again. Next time the music stops, everyone dives for a chair, but obviously one of them doesn't get one, so he's out. And so on till there's just one chair left and 2 dancers. Skedonlathi shrugged. We move around, he said. If we win, we get good grazing for 2 years, 3 maybe. If we lose, we have to go to the bad land where the grass is thin and there's very little water. But that makes us fight harder the next time we go to war. Valens stood up. He was disappointed. These people are stupid, he said. Make him tell you where his secret way across the desert is. Do what it takes. I don't want him for anything else. He made a point of not looking back as he left the tent. He didn't want to see terror in the prisoner's eyes if it was there, and if it was something else there instead, he knew it wouldn't interest him. He went back to his tent, drank some more water, and called a staff meeting in 2 hours. My own fault, he thought. I wanted them to be more than just savages. I wanted him to tell me that the girl's father had sent him on a quest for something. Her weight in gold or 500 milk-white horses, or even the head of the Vidani Duke in a silver casket. I could have forgiven him for that. But instead they're just barbarians, and they killed my poor cousin. I can't put that in a letter. It's just crude and ugly. He put his feet up on the bed, closed his eyes. Useful information. A map, or the nearest thing to it that could be wrung out of the savage on a log. A map marked with the name and territory of each sect. No, that wouldn't be of any use, not if they moved around all the time. All right, a list then. The names of all the sects. He was sure there wasn't a definitive list anywhere, just a collation from various scrappy and unreliable sources. What else? What else, for pity's sake? He had a specimen for study. If he had a talking roebuck or boar or partridge, he could interrogate for information likely to be useful to the hunter. He couldn't think of a great many things he'd like to ask a roebuck. Why do you lie up in the upland woods at night and come down the hill just to feed just before dawn? When do you leave the winter grazing and head up to the outer woods for the first sweet buds? But torturing data out of a savage was a chore he was pleased to leave to others, even though he knew they wouldn't get the best, choicest facts because they didn't have the understanding. The truth is, Valens realized, you can only hunt what you love. Chasing and killing what bores or disgusts you is just slaughter, because you don't want to understand it, get into its mind. My father never understood that, he thought. He hunted and made war because he liked to win. I'm better at both than he ever was. He sent orders, hustling out the intrusive thoughts. Soon he'd be on duty again, holding the full picture in his mind. Wasn't there some tribe or sect somewhere who believed that the world was an image in the mind of God? That he thought or dreamed the whole world, and things only existed so long as he held them in mind? There were, of course, no gods, but you could see how a busy man might like to believe in something like that. An hour later, a doctor came, bothering him about his ankle. He managed to be polite, because the other man was only doing his job. Besides, there was something on his mind that wouldn't go away. It took him a long while to realize what it was. The problem buzzed quietly, like a trapped fly in his mind, all through the staff meeting, disrupting the pattern he was trying to build there like a bored dog in a room full of ornaments. In fact, it was the constant barrage of names, people, places, that finally showed him where it was. After the staff had dispersed, he called for 2 guards, and went into the tent where the prisoner was being held. Skedonlathi was in a starry state. He lay on his face on the ground, his back messy with slash cuts, his hair slicked with blood. He didn't look up when Valens came in. We got the list, said one of the guards. At least we got a list, if you see what I mean. Could be a load of shit he thought up out of his head just to be ornery. Valens had forgotten about the list, which seemed rather reprehensible, since so much pain and effort had gotten into procuring it. Difficult bastard, the guard went on. Was he making conversation, like someone at a diplomatic reception? He really doesn't like it when it hurts, but each time you've got to start all over again, if you follow me. We've had to bust him up quite a bit. That's all right, Valens said. You cut along and get some rest. Write up your report. They left, changing shifts, quite usual. Valens went over and sat on the log. The prisoner didn't move, so he tugged on the chain once or twice. I wanted to ask you, he said. What does your name mean? He hadn't expected a reply straight away, so a guard had to apply a little pressure. He repeated the question. It took 3 tries before the prisoner spoke. What the hell do you want to know that for? Curious, Valens said. I'm looking for, I don't know, some little glimmer of light, a chink in the wall I can peep in through. What does your name mean? Come on, it can't hurt you to tell me. I can't. Valens sighed. There's some taboo on saying your name to outsiders? Once they know your name, they can steal your soul or something? The other man laughed. No, that's stupid, he said, but there's no word for it. Ah. Valens nodded to a guard. You know, he said, I believe this man hasn't had anything to drink for several hours. Get him some water. He took the cup, which was nearly full. He emptied a third onto the ground. Paraphrase, he said. What? Well, Valens said, what's the closest you can get in our language? Skedon Lothi was looking at the dark brown dust where the water had soaked away. It's a kind of bird, he said, but they don't live north of the desert. Describe it. Hesitation. Valens poured away a little more water. It's small, the man said. Bigger than a thrush, but smaller than a partridge. You mean a pigeon? No, not a pigeon. The prisoner, as well as being in agony and despair, was also annoyed. It's a wading bird with a long beak. Brown. It feeds in the mud. I see, Valens said. Pardon me saying so, but it sounds an odd creature to name a great warrior after. I assume your parents wanted you to grow up to be a great warrior? It's the bird of our family, Skedon Lothi said. All the families have a bird. I see, like heraldry. No, almost petulant. We follow a bird. Each family follows a different one. Follow, Valens repeated. You mean you choose one as a favorite? No, follow. Petulant to angry now. When the grazing is used up and goes bad, we follow our family's bird, the first one we see. We follow it for a day from dawn to sunset, and where it stops to roost is where we move to. Good heavens, Valens said. But supposing it just flies around in circles? If it stops, we drive it on. Makes sense, Valens said. And a waiter would always fly to water, of course. Do all the families follow water birds? But that was all. Even pouring away the last of the water in the guard's best efforts earned him nothing more, which was frustrating, and by then there wasn't enough left to justify further expense of time and energy. It was the glimmer of light he'd been looking for, but it had gone out. He drew his finger across his throat. The guard nodded. Valens went back to his tent and gave orders to break camp and move out. It's not an interrogation, Mealdeka said, or anything like that. The mezzanine still looked apprehensive. But you want him to ask me questions. Let's say we want you to talk to someone who speaks your own language. They'd reached the gate. Like all forge gates everywhere, it was almost derelict. The latch had long since gone, replaced by a length of frayed rope, and the pintles of the hinges on one side had come halfway out of the wood. There was probably a knack to opening it without pulling several muscles, but Meal wasn't a regular visitor. Basically, so you can see how much we know about, well, all metalworking and things, and the other way around. The mezzanine shrugged. Well, if you think it'll help, he said. The key is always to establish. Meal grunted as he heaved at the gate. Communication. No point talking if you can't understand. All forge gates open onto identical yards. There must have been a time 200 or 300 years ago when all the blacksmiths in the world decided it would be a splendid thing to pave their yards with handsome square-cut flagstones. Once this had been done, a great decline of resources and enthusiasm must have set in. You'll search in vain in the history books for any reference to the cause of it, but the evidence is there plain as day. Those proud, confident flags are all cracked up now. Grass and young trees pushed up through the fissures, kept in check only by the seepage of tempering oil and a very occasional resented assault with the hook. Ivy and various creepers grow up through the scrap pile, their hairy tendrils taking an uncertain grip in the rust. Worn-out and broken tools and equipment wait patiently through the generations for someone to find time to fix them. There's always a tall water butt with moss on one side, close to the smithy door, which has scraped a permanent furrow where it drags. There's always a mound of perfectly good coal, inexplicitly left out in the wet to spoil. Kentakasene came out when he heard the yard gate scritch. He was almost unnaturally clean. Blacksmiths aren't called that for nothing, and he looked painfully nervous, as if he'd been chosen to be a human sacrifice. His greeting was splendidly formal, and he was wearing his best apron. "This is the man I was telling you about," Meal said. "I hope you've thought up some good questions." Kentakasene looked as though someone had just walked up to him and yanked out one of his teeth. "I'll do my best," he said. "Please come in. There's wine and cakes." Indeed there were, and Meal tried to be polite about fishing a flake of dark gray scale out of his cup before drinking from it. It tasted like eggs beaten in vinegar. The place looked pretty much the same as it had the last time he'd been there, as though it had been burgled by someone with a grudge against the owner. There were tools lying about on the benches and the floor, a hopeless jumble of hammers, stakes, tongs, sets, fullers. On the floor were chalked patterns for various pieces of armor, their meticulously drawn details scuffed by feet passing in a hurry. Every surface was thick with black grime. Everything glistened with spilled drops of water and new rust. "Here," Meal said to himself, "our guest will feel at home." But he didn't, by the looks of it. He had the air of a man who is trying hard not to give offense by showing disapproval. Kentakasene picked up on that straight away. The poor man was in pain, obviously. Meal felt bad about torturing him like this, but it had to be done apparently. "What I thought," Kentakasene said, mumbling, "was that we could start off." His words dwindled away as he looked at the expression on Vaatsi's face. "Sort of like a trade test," he said, "if you think that'd be in order." Meal waited for a response from the mezzanine, who just stood, registering distaste. "That sounds like a good idea," he said. "What do you have in mind?" Kentakasene's test would be to make a perfect circle, precisely 1 foot in diameter, out of quarter-inch plate. "Feel free to use whatever you like," he added nervously, "if you think that'd be—" "Fine," Vaatsi said. "Material?" Kentakasene picked up a 3-foot square of steel and offered it to him. It didn't mean anything to Meal, of course, except he noticed that someone had recently made a job of scrubbing the rust off of it with a wire brush. Like a woman being visited by her mother-in-law, he thought. But Vaatsi studied it for some time, turning it over in his hands and pinching at the edges with his fingers. "Have you got calipers?" he said. "Calipers," Kentakasene repeated. "Yes, of course." He dug a pair of calipers out of a pile of junk and handed them over. Vaatsi took 3 or 4 measurements and handed them back. "Dividers," he said, "or a bit of string and nail if you haven't got any." Kentakasene had some dividers, also files, a chest drill and bits, a rule. Vaatsi stared at it in horror for a couple of seconds, and various other things Meal had never heard of. Vaatsi took them and laid them out on the floor like a huntsman displaying the day's bag, the files in order of length and so on. With the dividers he measured a foot off the rule, then knelt on the floor and scribed his circle on the plate. He did it 3 times, but Meal could only see one scribed mark. Next he stood up, clamped the plate upright in the leg vise, and started to drill holes all round the circle with the chest drill. This took a very long time. Meal soon lost interest and sat down to read the book he'd had the wit to bring with him. Each time he looked up, he saw Kentakasene rooted to the spot, watching like a dog at a rabbit hole. When Vaatsi had finished drilling the ring of holes, he laid the plate on the bed of the anvil and cut through the web between the holes with a small cold chisel. This freed something that looked like a gear wheel. Next, he wiped his finger through the nearest accumulation of soot, rubbing black into the thin graven line left by the dividers. Then he fixed the gear wheel thing in the vise and picked up a file. Meal went back to his book. He'd almost finished it when he heard Vaatsi say, "I'm sorry." He looked up. Vaatsi was holding what looked to him like a steel platter. He handed it to Kentakasene as if it was something revolting and dead. "I did the best I could," he said, "but the drill bits are blunt, the files are soft as butter, there's no light in here, and the plate isn't an even thickness. And," he went on, "I made a botch of it. It's 20 years since I did any serious hand filing, so I guess I'm out of practice." "It's perfect," Kentakasene said. Meal looked at him. He had the expression of someone who'd just seen a miracle, a revelation of the divine. "It bloody well isn't," Vaatsi said. "I can't measure it, of course, but I say the tolerance is no better than 2/1000 of that. And if you can call that a square edge, I don't." Meal saw Kentakasene staring at him. He looked utterly miserable. "It's better than I could do anyway," Kentakasene said. "Look, I'll show you." He took a drill and made a hole in the middle of the platter, passing a length of steel rod through it, and clamped the rod in the vise. Then he laid his fingers on the edge and set it spinning. Perfect, he repeated. Emil looked at it. It was as though the spinning disc was absolutely still. Well, I'll try again if you like, Vatsy says. Maybe if I took it outside where I could see it better? Emil had seen more than enough pain in his life, but rarely such suffering as Kantakaseni went through as the day wore on. Next he asked Vaatzis to make a square, then to draw out a round bar on the forge into a triangular section, then to make 6 identical square pegs to fit perfectly into the square hole on the back of the anvil. Each time, the outstanding quality of the result seemed to hurt him like a stab wound, and Vaatzis' escalating self-reproaches were even worse. Emil excused himself at one point, went up the hill to a friend's house, and borrowed another book. It was going to be a long day. He got the impression that Kantakaseni had set himself the task of finding something the foreigner couldn't do better than he could, and that he knew he was going to fail, and that his whole world was coming apart. Emil enjoyed reading and listening to tragedy, but only when it came from the author's guarantee that it wasn't real. An hour before sunset, he decided to call a halt to the butchery. By that point, Kantakaseni had the mezzanine doing sheet work, which was, of course, Kantakaseni's specialty in his capacity as armorer royal. There had been a note of desperation, close to hysteria, in his voice when he gave Vaatzis the specifications. A left-hand shell gauntlet, fluted in the mezzanine style, with 4 articulated lames over the fingers, the cuff moving on sliding rivets. Here, at least, Emil could understand some of the technical language. He had a pair of gauntlets to exactly that specification, for which Kantakaseni had charged him 9 silver thalers. He remembered thinking what a bargain they were at that price when he took the delivery. Accordingly, he marked his place, closed the book, and shuffled discreetly close to watch. Vaatzis started with a sheet of steel plate, not the one Kantakaseni provided him with, because he looked at it and said it wasn't even, too thick at the top and too thin in the middle. So instead, he scrabbled about in the scrap pile like a terrier until he found a rusty offcut he reckoned would just about do at a pinch. He traced the pattern onto it with chalk, cut it out on the shear, stopped cutting to take the shear to bits, make and fit a new pivot pin, clout the frame with a hammer, walk round it several times, stooping down and squinting, clout it a few more times, put it back together again, because he couldn't be expected to do accurate work on a shear that was completely out of line. Next he formed the component parts on the anvil and the swage block. It was impossible, he declared, to do anything at all with either of them. If only he had a lathe, he could at least make a decent ball stake. Kantakaseni went white as a sheet and stood opening and closing his hands. And he punched the holes, having first stripped down and reworked the punch. Then he did the fluting. Half an hour of tiny woodpecker taps, quick as the patter of falling rain, his left hand constantly moving the work, while his right hand fluttered like a hummingbird's wing. It was worthless, he declared as he held up the finished shell, because the flutes were uneven in depth and spacing, and the ridges weren't sharply defined. He cut the slots for the sliding rivets with the blunt drill and the buttersoft files. Finally, more in sorrow than anger, he adjusted the fit of the moving parts, peened the rivets so that everything glided perfectly, declared it was hopeless, cut the rivets off with a chisel, and did them again. Then he handed the gauntlet to Kantakaseni, who took it as though it was his own heart, torn out with the tongs through his smashed ribs. "I'll polish it if you want," Vatsy said, "but it would be a waste of soap. Useless." Kantakaseni turned it over a few times, slipped it onto his left hand, flexed his fingers, turned his wrist. The 5 wood-louse sections moved up and down like the skin of a breathing animal. He took it off and gave it to Emil, who could hardly bear to touch it. He'd seen more than enough for one day. "Well," he said. The gauntlet was still on his hand. Somehow he didn't want to take it off. He could hardly feel it. Part of him was thinking, 9 thalers. He had the grace, catching sight of Kantakaseni's face, to feel ashamed of himself for that. Getting out of the forge wasn't something that could be achieved gracefully. He thanked Kantakaseni as best he could, and walked away, leaving the gate open because he couldn't face fussing with it. All he wanted to do was leave behind the worst embarrassment he'd ever had to endure. They'd been walking for 10 minutes up through the winding alleys, before he felt safe to say anything to the mezzanine. "Was that necessary?" "How do you mean?" Perhaps the man simply didn't understand. But that wasn't very likely. He might be all sorts of things, but he wasn't a fool. The whole thing had been deliberate, from start to finish. You might as well have cut his throat, or bashed his head in. "What?" Vaatzis frowned. "Did I do something wrong?" More than anything he'd ever wanted in his life, Emil wanted to hit the mezzanine. Nothing else would do but to smash his face, until the cheekbones and jaws and teeth were beyond recognition as human. But if he did that, he'd have lost. You had to make your point, he said. But did you have to be so bloody cruel about it? Or you wanted to see some metalwork? Emil looked at him. Were you getting your own back? He asked. Slowly, Vaatsi shook his head. You needed to be convinced, he said, that I'm what I claim to be, and that I can do what I say I can. Now you are. I'm sorry if your blacksmith got cut up in the machinery, but I didn't start it. Besides, he went on, this whole setup was a joke. Not to him, Emil said. Vaatsi's waved the objection away. It's not a subjective issue, he said. There's a right way to do things and a wrong way, and his was wrong. Everything was wrong about it. Tools useless and jumbled up all over the place, no decent workspace, nothing calibrated or even straight, every single thing out of true. He shook his head. If I hurt him, he deserved it. It was his shop, so it must be his fault. It's an abomination. Emil was silent for a moment. Then he said, Oh. Vaatsi's laughed. You think that word is a bit odd. You mean coming from me? Well, I wouldn't have imagined you'd think of it in those terms. Vaatsi stopped walking and looked at him. The thing you need to understand, he said, if you want to understand what I have to offer, if you want to understand me even, the one thing that matters is the principle of tolerance. The word didn't fit at all. Neil repeated it. Tolerance? Vaatsi nodded. That's right. Do you know what it means? To an engineer. Neil shrugged. I thought I did, but maybe I don't. Tolerance, Vaatsi said, is the degree something can differ from perfection and still be acceptable. It's not always the same. For one job it could be 0.003 of an inch, and for something else it could be 0.005. The point is, if you want to make something that's good, you need your tolerance to be as small as possible. That's the key to everything. It's what the guilds are built on. It's everything Mezentius stands for. Precision, tolerance. We try and get as close to perfection as we possibly can, and we don't tolerate anything less than that. He smiled. Your man back there, he said. I don't suppose he even thinks in those terms. If it just about works and it sort of fits, it's good enough. Neil thought about his gauntlets, which had saved his hands in 6 battles. We don't tolerate the word enough, Vaatsi went on. Either it's good or it isn't. Either a line is straight and a right angle is a right angle, or it's not. It's true or it's out of true. True or false, no gray areas. Do you see what I mean? Fine, Neil said. Which are you? Vaatsi laughed. Oh, I'm all right, he said. I've never had any doubts on that score. You mean, if I believed so strongly in the Mezentine way, how come were they going to kill me for abominating? Neil didn't say anything. The trouble is, Vaatsi went on, the guilds have lost their way. They've become... He made a vague gesture. I'm not quite sure how to put it. I suppose you could say they've become too tolerant. What did you say? They tolerate a lie, Vaatsi said. The lie is that their specifications, which are written down in the books and can't be changed ever, are perfect and can't be improved on. And that's wrong. Obviously, it's wrong. We can do better, if only we're allowed to. That's what I mean. Their tolerances are too great. They make it an article of faith that you can't cut this line closer than 1,000th, when actually it's possible to shave that by half. That's the real abomination, don't you think? Neil didn't say anything for a while. And that makes it all right for you to humiliate perfect strangers. Vaatsi shrugged. Either he'll learn from it and be a better craftsman now that he's seen a better way, or else he won't, in which case he isn't fit to be in the trade. I remember my trade test when I was an apprentice. Actually, it was the same as your man back there sent me, to file a perfect circle, but it had to be right. The tolerance was 1,000th of an inch, which is the thickness of a line scribed with a guild specification dogleg caliper. The material was 1/2-inch plate, and the edge had to be chamfered to exactly 45 degrees, in accordance with a guild half-corner square. If you got it right, you passed and got your guildian membership. Neil nodded. Well, what happened if you got it wrong? Did they burn you at the stake or something? Vaatsi shook his head. The finished piece is measured with the guild's prescribed gauges, basically a hole the right size cut into a big 1/2-inch sheet. It has to be an exact fit. They test it with a candle. If light shows through, or if a speck of soot finds its way into the join, you fail. If that happens, there's a sort of ceremony. They put you in a cart with your work hung round your neck on a bit of string, and on guild meeting day, when everybody goes to the guild hall to hear the speeches, they drive you round and round the town square from noon to sunset. People don't jeer or throw things at you. It's worse than that. It's dead quiet. Nobody says anything, they just stare. For that half a day, you're completely I don't know what the right word is. You're completely separate, apart. You're up there and they're down below looking at you, like you are everything that's wrong in the world, captured and brought out, so they can all have a good look at you and see what evil looks like. So they'll know it if they meet it again. Then at sunset, they get you down off your cart in front of everybody, and guild officers take your piece of work and they kill it. They bash it with hammers, they bend it and fold it over stakes, and finally they heat it up white hot in a furnace till it melts, and they pour the melted metal into sand, so it can't ever be made into anything else ever again. It took Meal a moment to find his voice. And that happened to you. Oh, good God, no, Vatsy said. I passed. It's incredibly rare, someone not passing. I actually think it's only happened 2 or 3 times in my lifetime, which goes to show the system works. It's a bit harsh, but it makes for good workmanship. And what happens to people who fail? Do they get thrown out of the city? Of course not. They learn their lesson, and the next year they take the test again. Nobody's ever failed twice. Fine, Meal said. I wouldn't recommend you trying to introduce that system here. I don't think that sort of thing would go down well. Well, of course not. You've got a long way to go, I can see that. Meal took Vatsy's back to his room. He had to make his report to the Duke, he said, and then the decision would be made about whether to accept his offer. We'll try not to keep you in suspense any longer than necessary, he told him. And he went off to find Orsi, thinking long thoughts about the nature of perfection. The Duke in Council considered his report, together with a written submission from the Armourer Royal, who gave his opinion that the Mezzantine possessed skills far in advance of anything known to the Vidani, and recommended in the strongest possible terms that his offer should be accepted. Further submissions were heard from the Exchequer, the Trade Commissioners, the merchant adventurers, and other concerned parties, after which the meeting debated the issue, with special reference to the effects of the aftermath of the recent war, the manpower position, the need to remodel the duchy's defense, and other pertinent factors. At the conclusion of the debate, the Duke and his special advisor, Meal Ducas, retired to consider their decision. After a brief recess, the Duke announced that the Mezzantine's offer was rejected.